Hello and welcome to my chick pot tutorial. For supplies, see the description below for a detailed list. I have also added the timestamps of each stage of the pot so that you can easily jump to any part of this process. We are going to start with the base shape of the pot. So with this video, I'm not going to really give details on the throwing process, especially because you're also welcome to hand build, coil, use molds, whatever process you really like to do that gets you to the base shape. Generally, I try to go for about as tall as wide, but it's also fun and you're more than welcome to go taller and skinnier. I just would recommend not going wider than the height just because it gets a little harder to pull those sides in. While we get to the actual forming of the shape itself, a little background on this project is that I started making these back in college when I started ceramics, kind of playing with how to cut the shape and form it after throwing, and I really liked how this would come out and had a lot of fun making these into mugs and planters and candy bowls. So I really am excited to share this with you and allow you to make some cute chicks with me. Anything along this process can of course be modified because it is your art, and ceramics gives us such a wide variety of opportunity to customize. So for this process, we're just doing the base shape and details, but always feel free to add extra things, feet, eyes, little accessories, whatever is really fun for you. I've also made these without the handles, so whatever kind of suits your fancy and fits the need that you're going for. Have a blast. If you are throwing your pots, once you get to the pulling stage, I recommend pulling vertically to get that height that you want and keeping the base as thin as you would like the top rim to be. From there you can kind of bulge out while still keeping the foot fairly small, just to give us a nice rounded bottom shape. So here you'll see me start to do that process, kind of feeling out exactly how wide and tall I really want this. And of course, use any throwing method that you're used to using. I didn't want to dive into the details of throwing in this video, so just have at it any way you would like. This pot has been a little wonky from the start, so I definitely have some interesting pulling going on, but in the end, it's turning out how I want it. So here you can see I aimed for more vertical at the moment, had a little thin spot up towards the top, but it's all kind of evening out now. And then next I will start to push that foot in with that outside pinky while pushing out with the inner hand to kind of bowl out that bottom inside. Again, mine is going a little wonky, but one nice thing about this pot is if you have a slightly uneven rim, You're always welcome to even it out by taking that top layer off, or if it's not too bad, since we are pulling the form in, you can definitely use a lower spot as where you put the tail. So there's a little bit of give in this process that you can definitely work with. So while I straighten those walls and get it off the wheel, notice how the foot is a little smaller than the rest of the pot. I like a more vertical wall as well, but if it goes in a little bit, that's also not a bad thing. That might make it a little bit easier to pull those sides in when we get to that tail shaping section. But here is our base shape. Now we're on to making the additions to the outside of the pot. So I'm going to start by rolling out the extra ½ pound of clay that I had reserved, making sure to start from the center of the ball of clay, pushing out. This really helps to make sure that the edges don't get too thin while the center stays too thick. I also like to flip my clay a few times, just in case there is a little bit of stick on the board. It helps to make it roll more even more quickly. And here I'm using a roller that has little guides attached to the side of it. But another great method that is common is to use paint sticks or pieces of wood that give you the desired thickness. The largest setting on this roller for me is 1/4 inch, but you're welcome to go any thickness that you like to work with. Once you have an even thickness, I always just try to make sure all my air bubbles that are visible are out, so I give a little poke with a knife or a needle tool and then kind of press it back down. Here I'm just wiping it down a little bit to even out any textures, make sure the edges aren't too dry, and just kind of give it an overall check over. I went and grabbed my ruler really quick, and here I'm going to start kind of mapping out the width I want for my wings. I tend to aim for about 1 inch just because it tends to work for the size pot that I make, and I just kind of like it. But I'm also going to do a straight line. You're welcome to taper them or fan them out, add feathers, whatever is really fun for you. Here I am just drawing kind of a guideline to start. And then from this point, I will mark off 1 inch at 2 different spots along that line just to make sure that it stays even all the way down. And I will be cutting 2 strips to prepare for the wing handles. I'm using an X-Acto knife for this process, but if you would prefer to use a needle tool or a different type of tool, of course, anything really works as long as you're getting a nice defined line. So now that both handles are cut, I'm just getting my scraps kind of off to the side. We will be using them for creating the beak, and I do plan to make a second set in case I need a backup. If you live somewhere with dry weather like I do, it's definitely important to cover any pieces you're not actively working with some sort of plastic. So here I'm just keeping that from getting too dry so I can work with it later. And now that that's out of the way, I'm just checking out these handles, and I'm going to start cutting them into the shape I actually want. So to start, I'm just looking at the size of the pot that I threw, kind of seeing roughly the length I'm looking for. As an easy cheat, I kind of just go with the handle being the full length of the pot, and then once it is kind of pulled into that wing shape, That should be just long enough to give it that curve without extending past the pot. So I marked that off for myself, and the top edge is going to be flat. That will be where it mainly connects to the top of the bird. And the bottom I will then round out to kind of give it some type of cute little end. That's definitely another spot where you can use some artistic license to flare it or curl it or anything, you know, that you kind of see as you're going through. So again, here now I have the two the same length, saving those scraps, and I'm going to work on that curve. So I tend to just eyeball that curve because I am going to sponge it down to round it quite a bit. But you're welcome to use a half circle type tool or anything that you really have that might give you a very even shape for yourself. But either way, I recommend once that curve is cut, that you can stack it with the other piece so that you do get the same curve on both sides. So now that those rounded edges are matching and I made sure my knife was not too angled so the walls are even, I'm pulling out a little bit of those scraps to start shaping this beak. I do keep it basically just the thickness of the slab that was rolled, but then stack two pieces, and this kind of gives a fairly simple way to make that beak shape, and it's kind of a style that I like anyway. So I'm going to cut out just a triangle that I think would be a good size. I always aim too big because you can always cut back, but again, there's so many scraps you can definitely remake as you feel needed. So I rounded off those corners of that triangle, and I'm just trying to make sure that it is an even shape. Now here I'm going to make a smaller version, so maybe just a little bit bigger than half the size of that first one. And again, just kind of eyeball the balance that you want for the style of your chick. But it's just a little rounded triangle. The bigger triangle will be the top part of the beak, and then of course the little one will then become the bottom part. Now that I have them cut and rounded, I decide the first triangle is a little too big, so I'm just going to make that a little bit better to the size that I want. Another thing I recommend as you decide on your size is to either make a few and then hold them up to your pot to see what you like, or just start by holding them up to your pot so that you immediately have what you know you want. But either way, kind of find that balance of size that you like and check them out by stacking them, just in case something looks a little bit off to you. Now that I have the shape and size I want, I'm just going to sponge down the edges a little bit to round them and keep this hydrated since it is a small piece of clay. If you're newer to ceramics, definitely try to squeeze most of the moisture out of your sponge when doing this part of the process, just to make sure that it doesn't get too wet and sloppy on you. It really should just be a light moisture and light pressure in order to get the desired shape that you like. Now it's time to score, so you're just going to make little scratch marks where they will connect, kind of centered, and align the back edge to each other so that that little triangle is pulled back a little bit from the tip of the larger triangle. So we have scoring. Now I'm just dabbing a tiny bit of water just to make sure that there's a really tight connection. And with a little bit of pressure, just tap that into place and make sure that it feels pretty solid. Now I'm going to grab my wood tool, which I forgot to pull out for the table as well. So with that tool, I'm going to kind of get into those connection seams and smooth them down to truly connect those two pieces and make sure that there is less likelihood that there will be a crack or break off from each piece. So here, just kind of going in, again, light pressure, pulling a little bit of the clay from the top piece down into the other. And this is very minor. Since this is such a small piece, I don't really do the coil connection for this part. It's just enough to really make sure that suction is happening. Then I go in with a dry or very slightly moist brush and just kind of smooth out those seams. Since it's so small, I want to use the brush to get into all those areas in a clean way. Then it's time to make sure that the back is also smoothed down. So again, I go in with that wood tool and just kind of pull in both directions to make sure there's a nice smooth side there as well. So that's the beak done. I'm going to put that back under and pull these handles out one more time since I did not sponge down those edges. So again, with a very slightly damp sponge, going in and rounding those edges out a little bit. This is also a great time if you have any little textures or dents or oddly cut edges. You can go in and fix all those right up with the sponge. So just take your time to make sure that they're in a good place so they can start to dry a little bit before forming. And there we have the prepared wing handles and beak. I'm just going to cover up all of those pieces and save those scraps to make a second set. Now that the second set is made, I've let them sit for just a little bit of time, and I'm now going to start forming that shape. I'm aiming for kind of that traditional handle shape and then flaring the bottom out just a little bit. And of course, again, any shape that you'd like or no handles at all, whatever your preference would be. I also used to like pulling my handles for these, so anything that kind of works for what your end goal is. Once I have that little squiggle started, I'm just going to try to pull up and show you the size and angle that I want on the pot. So I like to line it up pretty close to the rim for these, and I'm just seeing how much curve I'm going to be able to get. If it's too round for you, definitely cut that top a little bit shorter, or feel free to push that angle to wherever you want it to truly curve. And again, just kind of testing it out. That's one of my longer handles, so now you can see I've given myself a longer option, and I seem to like that a little bit more, but we'll see which one I ended up going with. That's another reason why I like to make multiple sets, so I can have different sizes and kind of feel out where I'm at. Both these sets are 1 inch thick still. I just gave myself a little more length the second time. So now that I have kind of found my general curve I like, I am laying the second piece on top so that the curve is as close to matching as possible in case they do dry out a bit and we don't have enough wiggle room once it's time to attach. This will also just help stabilize in the attachment process. So stack, lightly kind of snake it around, and then we'll lay it out, cover it, and let them sit while I trim the pot. Again, make sure all your shapes are pretty close and the edges are wiped down if there's any weird spots that you see. You will definitely have some chances to clean up edges and change the shape once we are attaching, but it's just nice to make sure it's close to what we want at this stage. So now it's time to trim and shape the pot while those handles and beaks are drying. Hopefully by now your pot is roughly leather hard. Make sure that it is hard enough to trim and not have any major damage to it. So if you need to wait a little longer, definitely do so. If you are not using a wheel or throwing for this process, then just work to make sure the bottom is rounded out along that bottom corner into as wide of a flat spot as you feel comfortable for the stability of the pot. As I trim, I like to save all the little scraps to recycle later. I like to recycle as much as I can since it's nice to have extra clay and not waste it. So I just keep a bucket next to me during the process and collect any extra little chunks and scraps, and then that way cleanup is a little bit easier too. Now you can see I'm starting to kind of cut that round shape, mainly trying to almost make it a perfect circle, but of course we want to keep that flat spot so that, especially if it has liquids or anything that can fall out, that it won't be pouring over or getting knocked around. If you would like to add three-dimensional literal feet to the bottom of this pot, you are also welcome to make it a perfect half circle. But I would only recommend that if you're going to give it 3 to 4 little bottom feet to make sure that it doesn't tumble. Once your pot is trimmed and your wings and beaks are approaching leather hard, we can then go to the actual shaping of the pot. So here I've moved back to my table and I'm just checking to see that the edge is good. I have, because that wobbly throw, I have a little low and thin spot, and I think that's going to be a good spot for me to cut into. So I'm looking at about halfway down the pot, then I raise it up just a little bit. Again, I want to cut smaller first. I can always cut more out if it's not enough. And I'm going to trace kind of a V shape around to get that kind of cut that I'm looking for. So here I'm very lightly scratching in that shape up to the little point that I made for myself. And once I think it looks pretty even, I go in and follow with an actual cut. So once that looks pretty good, I'm just going to go in and make sure that the clay is hydrated enough to be flexible, a little bit around the sides and those edges. I did let this get a little too far along in the leather hard stage, so want to just make sure it's able to bend without any cracking. Once that feels like it's ready, I'm going to use my thumbs and kind of push from the outside in, very little, kind of short at first, and then work my way wider and wider to help that flexibility of the clay, and just see how far does that cut let the clay actually go. Once the top edge is starting to touch is a great time to kind of look at the side and see, oh, is that the angle of tail I want? I personally think that's a little too high and small, so I'm going to gently pull that back out and then add just maybe a 1/4 inch more off of that. So again, I'll put my little guide point, lightly trace about the width more I want to cut out. Always, again, start a little bit smaller just in case it's enough for you. And then I'll do the same process of guiding it back in to create that curve and see if it's the shape I actually want. So just note as you're playing around with this shape and cut, if you go deeper, it's going to give you a lower and potentially smaller tail, depending on how you cut the side. So then the other side of that is if you would like the tail to stick out more, then you would widen that V from the top portion to that point so that it would pull the sides in a lot more dramatically, and that can really change the way that that tail sticks out. So it might take some playing around, but generally try to find kind of an even looking V and then play from there. And once you find the shape that you want, go in and bevel those edges so that they connect a little bit better and have a little more surface area. So by that I mean I'm going to cut one edge at a 45-degree angle, and then when you go to the other side, you need to make sure that that same angle is happening. So you saw I held my knife to the one cut, and I'm just going to keep it at that angle and slide it over to the other side. So now I'm cutting the inside edge of the pot rather than the outside. That way when those edges are folded together, they line up and kind of create a smooth surface with a ton of connection points. After the bevel, you can go in and score those two new edges that you cut, just to allow, again, better suction and better support to each other. And then to hydrate those scoring marks, you can either use a brush and just let it dab in there, or again, just use your finger, whatever method you like. Then we're going to push it back into that shape that we decided would work for us. So again, starting with kind of pulling from the center but allowing those top edges to connect, and then getting a little more pressure and distance the more you go to pull that center bit in and guide it to meet in all places. It definitely will take a couple different angles to support the top while stretching, things like that. But once you have it together, I kind of just do an initial pull over of those seams just to see how much is really connected. And then we will go in and add a coil. This really helps to strengthen the seam point, and especially if any clay is a little bit thinner from the process of getting them attached. This will make sure it's thick enough to keep from cracking or becoming a weak point when it's in use. So I'm going to roll out a little tiny coil, kind of like when we roll with the rolling pin. Start from the center and work your way out so that you don't get that super crazy thin spots randomly throughout your coil. And then line it up along the seam. For this one, I'm focusing on the inner seam having a decent sized coil, especially because you won't see it as much, and also we can get that extra support from the inside. So I'm just going to push that against the seam a little bit with my wood tool, and then once attached, just kind of lightly scrape each edge to smooth that coil into the pot on both sides. Once it is smoothed in, then I'm going to actually try to make it flush with the pot. So kind of push that center down and then use the sponge in a moment to evenly spread any excess clay around so it looks like there was no coil. When doing all of this, similar to when you throw or do any form shaping, make sure to support the outside of the pot so that nothing is pushed past its boundary, we don't lose that seam that we started to connect, and everything kind of holds stronger. So now I'm just looking at the outside and I see there's definitely a weak spot in my seam, especially if I'm pushing from the inside a little bit. So I'm going to add another coil on the outside. Same process, a little bit thinner just because this side doesn't seem to need quite as much now that the inside is supported. I'm going to wet that down, lay the coil on, and again use the wood tool to push and smooth and then sponge over to make it look a little more seamless. And also at this point you can use the sponge or your hands to fix any odd little divots in the clay or any unrounded spots that you think need a little touch up. And with that we have our base shape done for the chick pot. It should have a little tail sticking out and then an even curve up to that top, unless you wanted to modify in any other way. And now for the final stage of attaching those wings and the beak. At this point, your pot, now that we worked with it, should be leather hard, and the wings and beak should also be about the same hardness, maybe a little softer. I personally did not wait long enough, so my clay is very wet in this attaching process. So if that is also you, it is possible to attach. You'll just have to finagle the shape a little bit and really support as you start to put it on your pot. Either way, I start by just double checking, did I have any dents or weird things happen while they were drying, sponge any of those off, and then I'm going to prepare them to attach them to the pot. So once that's all checked, I'm then going to score the edges. Now that I know that's where I want them to attach, you can always score later, and I think I actually do that on the second handle. But you know, whatever makes the most sense for you. I also like to score that top part just because it makes a little bit more of a mark when I'm lining it up. So as you'll see, I'm just kind of holding it against, getting it eye level with the pot to see what height I really want. Once I see that, I'm going to give it a tiny push onto the pot just to make a little mark where I can mark the scoring as well. So on those marks, I'm going to grab my X-Acto knife and just cross-hatch score that top and bottom part, making sure to align directly vertically from each other. Sometimes when I push my pieces on for a guideline, it's a little crooked, so you'll want to make sure they're directly in line. You can also use a needle tool or a scoring tool, whatever your preference is. I also now know where the bend is going to connect, so I am scoring that section as well. And with that, I dab a little bit of water. Because my clay was so wet, I probably didn't need to do this, but if you do have leather hard clay, you'll definitely want to hydrate it. And then it's time to push on. Make sure you have good support on the pot and just give it a nice, firm, but still slightly light push, just enough to help it connect. Same to the bottom, making sure you are vertically lined up and your heights are correct. As you can see, my clay is way too wet for this process, so I'm going to have to finagle it a little bit more. Now that I got that attached well enough to hold itself, I am going to roll out a few more of those small coils for the seam connections. On handles especially, this is very important to make sure that from all the pressure and pulling on it, they do not become weak over time. And now that we are going around a form, I kind of loosely tuck it under, but then we'll kind of tighten that curve around as I go, just so that we don't have a ton of slack going around that rim. That could become a little bit annoying once it gets to the compressing process. Once that's in there, I cut it to the length I wanted to make sure it's going to cover everything. And just like the seam on the tail, I'm going to use the wood tool to actually start by poking just down into the seam a little bit and then pulling both sides of the coil into the pot to make sure that that seam is truly strong. Once all of that is smoothed in and roughly connected, I'm going to go in again with that damp brush, wiping off any excess water. And I really like the brush for these areas because I can smooth in there and reach around the whole handle without too much effort. One thing to note with brushes is sometimes the bristles will create little dents, but you can go back in with the sponge and get those out. So here I am getting those extra little bits off and smoothing out any little dents, and now it's time to do the bottom half. So I'm going to speed this up, feel free to pause or anything you'd like if you're going along with me, but same process around the bottom section. Now that's done, I'm just going in to sponge and clean up anything, check for any scratches or dents I might have made with my fingers on those rims, and just overall shape that the way I would like. Now to move on to the other side, you really want to make sure that your handles are lined up with each other, vertically as well as across the pot. So definitely look from a bird's eye view as well as from the front at eye level, just to try to make sure that they're as even and perfect as possible. Then it's just the same process on the other side. So there we have it, two handles that are kind of like wings on this little chick. Here I'm going to just make sure that the angles of the curve itself are matching and fix any other little imperfections that I don't like about it. As you can see with my brush, I might have been a little heavy and cut into the handle a bit. So I'm just going to try to even those out and get it to the point where I'm satisfied. On to attaching the beak. This one's nice and simple compared to the handles. I chose the beak that I liked out of my options I gave myself, and now I'm just holding it up to the pot to find the placement I like. I personally like to let it go a little low, especially if I wanted to add eyes or something along the face, but if it is going to be used as a mug, it's nice to not have it too close to the rim so it doesn't hit your chin or anything like that. Once you find your placement, same as before, score, and then dab with water and attach. Once it's pressed on, then you can make another coil, wrap around, and do the same process to make sure it's really attached. This is also a great time to add any extra accessories like eyes or feet, anything like that. And we're done with our chick mug. Thank you so much for doing this tutorial with me. I hope you guys had a good time and are making some amazing things. I would love to see what you do with this, so feel free to send me any photos of your end results. Until next time, I hope you all have a wonderful time making new things.